Rome did not rush into conquering Greece. There was no dramatic opening act, no single night where everything collapsed. Instead, it unfolded the way many Roman expansions did, slowly, methodically, and with an exhausting amount of paperwork, diplomacy, and waiting around while other people argued. Greece, at this point, was no longer the unified land of heroic city-states from the history books. It was fractured, tired, and deeply committed to disagreeing with itself. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Greece was a collection of leagues, rival cities, and former powers still emotionally attached to their golden age. Athens was living off reputation. Sparta was no longer terrifying anyone. Macedon, once dominant under Alexander the Great, was now ruled by kings who were much less impressive and far more cautious. Meanwhile, Rome was becoming increasingly involved in Greek affairs while repeatedly insisting that it had absolutely no interest in ruling Greece at all. Rome's first real step into Greece came through Macedon. The Macedonian kings controlled much of mainland Greece, and Rome saw them as a potential problem. So Rome fought them, twice. The Macedonian Wars were framed as defensive actions, with Rome presenting itself as the protector of Greek freedom. This was convenient because it allowed Roman armies to march through Greek territory while being politely applauded for it. After defeating King Philip V of Macedon, Rome famously declared the freedom of the Greeks in 196 BCE. This announcement was received with cheers, celebrations, and a brief moment of optimism. Rome then stayed. Roman officials began overseeing disputes, mediating conflicts, and helping Greek cities manage their affairs. Freedom, it turned out, came with supervision. Greek cities continued to quarrel. Alliances shifted, leagues formed and collapsed. Rome was repeatedly asked to intervene, and Rome, never one to refuse an invitation, obliged. Each intervention brought more Roman influence, more soldiers, and more expectations that Greek states would behave themselves. They rarely did. The situation finally escalated with the Achaean League, a Greek alliance that decided it no longer appreciated Roman guidance. This led to the Achaean War, which ended in 146 BCE with the destruction of Corinth. Corinth was not just defeated, it was dismantled. Its population was killed or enslaved, its wealth shipped to Rome, and the message was delivered with unmistakable clarity. Rome was done pretending. After this point, Greece was effectively under Roman control. Officially, it was reorganized as the province of Achaia. Unofficially, daily life continued much as before. Romans admired Greek culture deeply. They studied Greek philosophy, copied Greek art, and educated their children in Greek schools. Wealthy Romans spoke Greek fluently and collected Greek statues in bulk. Greece had lost political independence, but culturally it was still doing quite well. For the average Greek, Roman rule was not immediately catastrophic. Taxes were collected. Governors rotated in and out, local elites adapted, cooperating with Roman authorities and maintaining their social status. Cities still held festivals, debates, and athletic games. Life went on, just under new management. In a strange way, Rome never truly tried to erase Greece. Yet it absorbed it. Greek culture became the intellectual backbone of Roman civilization, while Roman power provided order, stability, and an occasional reminder not to rebel. The conquest was less a violent takeover and more a gradual, unavoidable administrative outcome. By the time Greece realized it was no longer free, there was no dramatic moment left to resist. Rome had already settled in, rearranged the furniture, and started quoting Greek philosophers while doing so. And that, quietly and thoroughly, is how Rome conquered Greece. Roman rule in Greece did not arrive with a clear instruction manual. After the destruction of Corinth, there was no sudden transformation into something obviously new. Instead, Greece entered a long administrative afterlife, where the biggest changes happened quietly, handled by officials who preferred ledgers to speeches. The wars were mostly over. What followed was management. The province of Achaia was established, though Rome was careful not to advertise this too loudly at first. Greek cities were allowed to keep their councils, assemblies, and traditions as long as they did not interfere with Roman interests. This arrangement suited Rome well. Governing Greece directly would have required effort, and Rome preferred to rule indirectly whenever possible. As long as taxes arrived on time and rebellions did not occur, Rome was content to let Greeks govern other Greeks. Roman governors rotated through the region with predictable regularity. Some were competent. Some were corrupt. Most were temporary. Their primary concerns were taxation, legal disputes, and ensuring that no league or city became too ambitious. Governors relied heavily on local elites who quickly learned that cooperation was far more profitable than resistance. Greek aristocrats became intermediaries, translating Roman authority into familiar local structures. Economically, Greece became deeply tied to Rome. Greek ports fed Roman trade networks. Agricultural regions supplied grain, wine, and olive oil. Skilled Greek laborers, teachers, doctors, and artisans found work across the Roman world. Athens, in particular, reinvented itself as an educational destination. Young Roman elites traveled there to study philosophy, rhetoric, and the fine art of sounding intelligent while saying very little. Culturally, the relationship was uneven but oddly respectful. Romans continued to insist that they were superior conquerors, while simultaneously borrowing nearly every intellectual tool Greece had developed. Roman literature imitated Greek models. Roman gods were matched with Greek equivalents. Greek tutors educated Roman children. In private, many Romans admitted that Greek culture was better. In public, they continued conquering things. Not all Greeks were content. Periodic unrest flared, usually triggered by taxation disputes or particularly incompetent governors. These rebellions were small, brief, and decisively suppressed. Rome had learned that making examples worked better than prolonged warfare. A short display of force was usually enough to restore order, followed by reassurances that local customs would be respected. They usually were. Sparta, once feared across the Mediterranean, survived mostly as a historical curiosity. Yet Roman tourists visited to observe Spartan austerity like an exhibit. Athens survived as a cultural landmark rather than a political force. Other cities adapted by specializing: trade hubs, religious centers, or administrative nodes. Greece did not disappear. It reorganized itself around Roman priorities. Over time, Greek identity shifted. Being Greek under Rome no longer meant independence or dominance. It meant culture, education, and prestige. Greeks increasingly saw themselves as the intellectual class of the empire, even if they lacked political power. This was not entirely wrong. Roman emperors often consulted Greek philosophers, patronized Greek cities, and funded Greek festivals. Control and admiration existed side by side. By the early imperial period, Greece had become stable, predictable, and deeply embedded in Roman life. Roads were maintained, cities expanded, public buildings were restored. Rome preferred order to innovation, and Greece fit neatly into that preference. The era of constant warfare was over. In its place came a long stretch of calm, broken only occasionally by administrative chaos or imperial politics far away. The conquest of Greece, in hindsight, was never about destruction. It was about absorption. Rome did not replace Greek culture. It inherited it, repackaged it, and spread it across the empire. Greece lost its sovereignty, but it gained longevity. Its ideas outlived its armies. And so Greece entered a new phase of history. No longer free, no longer dominant, but very much awake, functioning, and quietly influential. Rome had conquered Greece, but Greece had settled into Rome, and neither would ever fully escape the other. So as Roman centuries passed, Greece became something like a well-preserved room in a very large house. It was no longer the owner, but it was carefully maintained, shown off to visitors, and occasionally rearranged to suit new tastes. Roman emperors understood the symbolic value of Greece. Ruling it was not just a matter of administration, but of prestige. Several emperors took a personal interest in Greek cities. Hadrian, in particular, admired Greece intensely and spent an unusual amount of time there. He funded temples, libraries, aqueducts, and public buildings, especially in Athens. To Roman eyes, this generosity looked like respect. To Greeks, it looked like survival through relevance. Cities that leaned into their cultural importance were rewarded. Cities that resisted were ignored or corrected. And Athens became less a city-state and more a museum that people still lived in. Philosophical schools continued operating, though they were increasingly formalized, repetitive, and safe. Students memorized arguments that had already been debated for centuries. Original thinking was less important than correct thinking. Rome liked stability, and philosophy that challenged authority was not especially encouraged. Greek religion also adapted. Traditional gods remained, festivals continued, and rituals were preserved, but everything existed within Roman tolerance. As long as religious practices did not interfere with public order or imperial loyalty, they were allowed. When Christianity later began spreading, Greece would once again adjust, slowly and carefully, the way it always had. Daily life under Roman rule was, for most Greeks, uneventful. Farmers worked the land, merchants traded, artisans produced goods for local and imperial markets. Roman law brought predictability, which many people quietly appreciated. Disputes were settled in courts instead of battlefields. Taxes were unpleasant but consistent. Peace, even under occupation, had advantages. Language was another quiet victory for Greece. While Latin dominated Roman administration, Greek remained the dominant language of the Eastern Mediterranean. Contracts, education, philosophy, and everyday conversation continued in Greek. Rome ruled politically, but Greece still spoke for itself. Over time, this linguistic divide shaped the empire, eventually splitting it culturally into Latin West and Greek East. The Roman military presence in Greece remained relatively light compared to other provinces. Actually, there were no massive frontier threats, no constant uprisings. Greece was not where Rome expected trouble. This allowed Greek cities a level of autonomy unavailable elsewhere. Control was firm, but distant. Rome trusted that Greece, exhausted by its own past, would not seriously rebel again. By late antiquity, many Greeks no longer thought of Rome as a foreign occupier. The empire had lasted generations. Roman citizenship expanded. Local elites became Roman elites. Identities blended slowly until the question of who ruled whom felt less important than how things functioned. Greece was no longer conquered land. It was inherited territory. Eventually, the Roman Empire itself changed shape. Power shifted eastward. Constantinople rose. Greek language and culture moved from admired background to central structure. In an unintended twist, yet the Eastern Roman Empire would become more Greek than Roman over time, preserving Greek traditions long after Rome itself faded in the West. Seen this way, the conquest of Greece never truly ended. It just transformed. What began as Roman domination slowly became cultural continuity under a different name. Greece lost battles, lost independence, and lost control of its future, but it never vanished. It remained, quietly persistent, adapting to each new layer of rule placed on top of it. And long after Roman legions stopped marching, Greek ideas were still doing most of the thinking. As centuries layered themselves quietly on top of one another, Greece settled into a role it had never planned for but performed remarkably well. It became the memory of civilization, not the engine of power, not the decision-maker, but the reference point everyone kept returning to when they wanted legitimacy, depth, or something impressive to quote. Roman education never fully detached itself from Greece. Even emperors who could barely speak Greek understood that Greek learning carried authority. Philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and rhetoric continued to flow outward from Greek traditions, even as political commands flowed inward from Rome. This imbalance became normal. Power gave orders. Culture explained why those orders made sense. Urban life in Greece slowly adjusted to imperial rhythms. City councils still met, but their debates rarely changed outcomes. Festivals continued, though funding increasingly depended on imperial favor. Statues honored Roman emperors alongside long-dead Greek heroes. Public spaces became layered with meaning, each generation adding monuments without removing the old ones, as if unsure which past they were supposed to forget. The countryside changed less. Rural Greece remained poor, labor-intensive, and repetitive. Roman rule did not improve farming techniques dramatically, nor did it worsen them. The land produced what it always had: olives, grapes, grain. Life moved according to seasons, not empires. For many villagers, Rome was an abstract idea represented mainly by taxes and occasional officials who spoke badly accented Greek. Slavery continued, though its form shifted. Greek slaves had once been war captives from rival cities. Under Rome, many slaves came from farther away, while Greeks themselves increasingly became slave owners, teachers, or managers within Roman households. The social structure adjusted without moral reflection. Survival encouraged flexibility. As Christianity spread through the empire, Greece again adapted quietly. Pagan temples did not collapse overnight. Philosophical schools debated theology instead of metaphysics. Old gods lingered as symbols, metaphors, or decorative art. Change arrived gradually, negotiated rather than imposed. Greece was practiced at this by now. The idea of being Greek continued to evolve. It became less about ancestry and more about education, language, and cultural fluency. Someone could be Roman by law and Greek by habit. This dual identity caused little anxiety. The empire was large enough to contain contradictions. When the western half of the Roman Empire began to fragment, Greece barely reacted. This was not the first power to rise or weaken around it. Administration shifted east. Its Constantinople became the center. Greek language became dominant at the highest levels of government. What Rome had once admired from a distance now became the operating system of an empire. In a long historical irony, Greece outlasted its conqueror by becoming indispensable to it. Rome conquered Greek territory, but Greek thought quietly shaped Roman endurance. By the time anyone noticed, the distinction no longer mattered. And so the story concludes without a clear ending. No final rebellion, no triumphant restoration, just continuity. Greece endured not by resisting Rome, but by letting Rome carry it forward, one borrowed idea at a time. By this stage, the relationship between Rome and Greece had become so ordinary that it rarely required explanation. Administration ran on habit, Culture ran on memory. No one expected Greece to become independent again, and no one seriously planned for it to disappear. It simply existed, suspended between past glory and imperial routine. Education remained Greece's quiet industry. Roman families continued sending their sons east to learn how to speak persuasively, argue elegantly, and reference philosophers who had been dead for centuries. Greek teachers were everywhere in the empire. Some were free, some were enslaved. All were necessary. Rome conquered territory easily. It never quite learned how to educate itself without Greece. Law and governance in Greece followed Roman frameworks, but local customs still shaped outcomes. Magistrates adapted Roman legal language to Greek realities. Disputes were settled with an understanding that order mattered more than justice, and stability mattered more than innovation. This suited Rome perfectly. Greece had already learned the limits of idealism. Public entertainment changed subtly. Theaters still hosted Greek dramas, though audiences now preferred familiar stories over experimental ones. Athletic games continued, but they no longer carried political significance. Competition existed for tradition's sake, not dominance. Spectacle had replaced ambition. Trade flowed steadily. Greek ports remained active, though they were no longer the center of Mediterranean commerce. They functioned as connectors rather than drivers. Goods passed through, ideas lingered longer. Greece became a place where things stopped briefly before moving on. The Roman military presence stayed minimal. There was no need for intimidation where compliance had become routine. Greece did not threaten Rome. It did not challenge authority. It did not inspire rebellion elsewhere. From an imperial perspective, Greece was solved. Even disasters passed quietly. Earthquakes damaged cities. Fires destroyed buildings. Emperors funded repairs when convenient. Local communities handled the rest. Rebuilding followed familiar patterns. The past was reconstructed again and again, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Precision mattered less than continuity. As centuries progressed, Greek historians wrote less about conquest and more about preservation. They documented traditions, rituals, and genealogies, aware that their role had shifted. History was no longer a warning or a celebration. It was maintenance. When new powers eventually arrived, they encountered a Greece already accustomed to adaptation. Yet Roman rule had trained it well. Authority changed hands, but daily life remained stubbornly recognizable. Language persisted, customs adjusted, memory endured. Looking back, Rome's conquest of Greece stands out not for its violence, but for its patience. It succeeded because it did not rush to replace what already worked. Greece was useful. Greece was impressive. Greece was manageable. And so Rome conquered Greece not by silencing it, but by listening carefully, copying selectively, and taking control quietly. The outcome was not dramatic. It was durable. That is why the conquest feels almost unfinished. Greece was never fully defeated, only redirected. Its voice softened, but it never stopped speaking. Rome ruled. Greece endured. And history, as always, chose the quieter survivor. By the final centuries of Roman rule, yet Greece had become something like a constant background noise in the empire, always present, rarely questioned. It was no longer a political problem, a military concern, or even a strategic priority. It was simply there, doing what it had learned to do best, continuing. Greek cities aged, streets narrowed. Old buildings were reused instead of replaced. Marble blocks from abandoned temples found their way into walls, baths, and churches. The past was not destroyed, it was repurposed. Greece did not cling to purity, it clung to usefulness. Roman citizenship, once rare and symbolic, became common. Legal distinctions blurred. Many Greeks were Romans on paper and Greeks in practice. This dual identity caused little conflict. By now, identity was flexible. Survival had taught that rigidity was expensive. Christianity, once a quiet presence, it became dominant. The shift was gradual, negotiated, and mostly administrative. Pagan rituals faded slowly. Philosophical language adapted itself to theology. Old concepts were reinterpreted rather than erased. Greece treated religion the way it treated everything else, cautiously, patiently, and with an eye toward continuity. Education continued, though its purpose changed. Philosophy was no longer about questioning the nature of reality. It was about organizing belief, defending doctrine, and preserving texts. Greece became an archive. A living one, but an archive nonetheless. Knowledge was protected by repetition rather than invention. The Eastern Empire increasingly relied on Greek language and culture. Latin receded. Greek became the language of governance, theology, and scholarship. At what Rome had once ruled from above now functioned from within a Greek framework. The conqueror had quietly adapted to the conquered. When the Western Empire finally fractured beyond repair, Greece did not experience shock. This was not the first collapse it had witnessed. Power shifted again, as it always had. Administration continued from Constantinople. Taxes were still collected. Life remained familiar. In this later world, few people remembered the moment Rome had declared Greece free or the moment Corinth had been destroyed. Those events belonged to books, not memory. What mattered was routine, markets opening, courts convening, festivals adjusted to new calendars. The conquest of Greece, by this point, existed mostly as a historical label. In practice, it had dissolved into something quieter and more permanent. Greece was no longer conquered land. It was foundational territory. Rome had arrived as a force. It stayed as a structure. Greece endured as content. And so the story ends the way it began, without drama. No final act, no clear resolution, just a long continuation, stretching forward, built on habits older than empire. Rome conquered Greece very slowly. Greece survived Rome even more slowly. And history predictably fell asleep somewhere in between. What remains, after all the administration and adaptation, is a strangely quiet conclusion. Rome never staged a final declaration announcing that Greece was fully conquered. There was no ceremonial ending, no symbolic surrender. Control simply settled in, like dust on old stone, accumulating slowly until it was no longer noticed. From a Roman perspective, Greece became one of the easiest provinces to manage. It was stable, educated, and predictable. It produced few surprises, which was the highest compliment Rome could give. Other provinces required legions, walls, and constant attention. Greece required respect, funding, and occasional patience. From a Greek perspective, Rome became another chapter rather than an ending. Greek history was already long enough to absorb conquerors without panic. Empires came and went. What mattered was that language survived, schools survived, and daily life remained intelligible. Independence had been lost before. Meaning had not. Even resistance, when remembered, was muted. The destruction of Corinth faded into abstraction. The declaration of freedom became irony. What endured instead were habits, how cities organized themselves, how people learned, how stories were told. Greece stopped trying to win history and focused instead on outlasting it. In the centuries that followed, scholars copying manuscripts in Greek monasteries preserved texts Rome itself had never fully understood. Philosophers became theologians, teachers became clerics. The intellectual inheritance Greece had given Rome now passed through new hands, unchanged in language, altered in purpose. This is why Rome's conquest of Greece feels incomplete. It achieved political control, but never cultural replacement. Rome ruled territory. Greece supplied meaning. One without the other would not have lasted. When people later spoke of classical civilization, they did not separate Roman power from Greek thought. They blended them because history had already done so. The conquest had fused rather than erased. And so, as quietly, without ceremony or closure, the story ends where it has been heading all along. Rome conquered Greece not by overwhelming it, but by settling into it. Greece survived not by fighting back, but by continuing forward. Nothing collapsed. Nothing resolved. Everything simply carried on. Which, for a conquest, is perhaps the most Greek outcome possible. At this point in the story, the word conquest barely applies anymore. What remained was not an occupied land, but a shared inheritance that neither side fully controlled. Rome governed, but it no longer reshaped. Greece adapted, but it no longer resisted. The tension that once defined their relationship had dissolved into routine. For ordinary people, history had stopped announcing itself. Children were born into a world where Roman rule was normal and Greek culture was assumed. Yet no one asked when Rome arrived or whether it would leave. Those questions belonged to ancestors. What mattered now was weather, harvests, local disputes, and the slow passing of seasons. Greek cities continued to age with dignity. Repairs were practical, not ambitious. New buildings reused old foundations. Statues were moved, renamed, or simply ignored. Memory softened. Grandeur faded into familiarity. Greece no longer tried to impress anyone. It had done that already. The Roman state, for its part, stopped thinking of Greece as conquered land and started thinking of it as infrastructure, a place that produced educated officials, reliable administrators, and stable revenue. Greece was useful in ways conquest rarely is. It reduced effort rather than demanding it. Even language reflected this calm surrender to continuity. Official decrees might still appear in Latin, but daily governance happened in Greek. Instructions flowed downward in one language and sideways in another. No one seemed troubled by this. Empires were large. They contained inconsistencies. As generations passed, Roman identity itself shifted. In the Eastern Empire especially, to be Roman increasingly meant speaking Greek, thinking in Greek categories, and living in cities shaped by Greek pasts. The conqueror slowly absorbed the conquered, not through force, but through exposure. Eventually, historians struggled to pinpoint where Roman Greece ended, and something else began. Labels changed, administrations reorganized, borders moved, but daily life remained recognizably Greek. Continuity outlasted authority. If Rome had wanted to erase Greece, it would have needed urgency, hostility, and replacement. It did none of these. Instead, it admired, borrowed, and supervised. The result was not domination, but coexistence under hierarchy. And so the conquest of Greece became something historians explain rather than something people experienced. It existed on parchment, not in streets, on timelines, not in memory. Rome conquered Greece very slowly. Greece accepted Rome even more slowly. What survived was not victory or defeat, but endurance. And that endurance, quiet and unremarkable, is the true ending of the story. In the end, there was no moment when Greece woke up and realized the story was finished. The ending arrived the way everything else had, gradually, without urgency, and largely unnoticed. Rome had long since stopped conquering Greece, and Greece had long since stopped caring about the distinction. And what survived was a rhythm. Cities opened their gates in the morning, markets filled, officials stamped documents, teachers repeated lessons refined centuries earlier. The empire above them shifted names, rulers, and priorities, but the structure beneath remained stubbornly familiar. Greece had learned that permanence did not require power, it required repetition. Roman emperors came and went, some competent, some disastrous. Their impact on Greece varied little. A generous emperor funded repairs, a negligent one did not. Either way, local life adjusted. The machinery of empire passed overhead, rarely disturbing the ground below. By now, even the idea of Roman authority had softened. It was distant, institutional, and abstract. Orders arrived from far away, taxes were paid, loyalty was expressed in formulaic ways. Yet no one imagined rebellion as a solution. Rebellion belonged to the past alongside heroism and tragedy. Greece had outgrown drama. The landscape itself reflected this acceptance. Ruins accumulated quietly. Temples became churches, theaters became stone quarries, statues lost names. What mattered was function, not origin. Greece reused its own greatness without sentimentality. Survival encouraged practicality. Knowledge moved inward. Libraries shrank. Manuscripts were copied slowly, carefully, sometimes incorrectly. But they were copied. That mattered more than perfection. Greece preserved ideas not because it believed they would rule the world again, but because forgetting them felt unnecessary. Rome, unknowingly, depended on this preservation. Long after legions stopped marching, Greek texts continued explaining logic, medicine, and ethics and governance. Power faded. Structure endured. Greece did not rule Rome's future, but it shaped how that future was understood. When later empires encountered Greece, they found something unexpectedly intact. Not politically powerful, not militarily relevant, but intellectually dense. A place layered with thought, habit, and memory. Rome had not erased Greece. It had sealed it inside continuity. This is why the conquest resists a clean ending. There is no final victory to celebrate, no collapse to mourn. Rome achieved control, but not replacement. Greece lost sovereignty, but not identity. Each side compromised without admitting it. History often prefers sharper conclusions. This one refuses them. Rome conquered Greece very slowly, by staying longer than resistance could justify. Greece survived Rome even more slowly. By refusing to disappear, nothing was resolved, nothing needed to be. The story ends not with triumph or defeat, but with persistence. Greece remained, Rome passed through, and the quiet continued, steady and unremarkable, exactly the way it always had. In the end, there was no moment when Greece woke up and realized the story was finished. The ending arrived the way everything else had, gradually, without urgency, and largely unnoticed. Rome had long since stopped conquering Greece, and Greece had long since stopped caring about the distinction. What survived was a rhythm. Cities opened their gates in the morning, markets filled, officials stamped documents, teachers repeated lessons refined centuries earlier. The empire above them shifted names, rulers, and priorities, but the structure beneath remained stubbornly familiar. In Greece had learned that permanence did not require power. It required repetition. Roman emperors came and went, some competent, some disastrous. Their impact on Greece varied little. A generous emperor funded repairs. A negligent one did not. Either way, local life adjusted. The machinery of empire passed overhead, rarely disturbing the ground below. By now, even the idea of Roman authority had softened. It was distant, institutional, and abstract. Orders arrived from far away, taxes were paid, loyalty was expressed in formulaic ways. No one imagined rebellion as a solution. Rebellion belonged to the past, alongside heroism and tragedy. Greece had outgrown drama. The landscape itself reflected this acceptance. Ruins accumulated quietly. Temples became churches, theaters became stone quarries, statues lost names. And what mattered was function, not origin. Greece reused its own greatness without sentimentality. Survival encouraged practicality. Knowledge moved inward, libraries shrank, manuscripts were copied slowly, carefully, sometimes incorrectly, but they were copied. That mattered more than perfection. Greece preserved ideas not because it believed they would rule the world again, but because forgetting them felt unnecessary. Rome, unknowingly, depended on this preservation. Long after legions stopped marching, Greek texts continued explaining logic, medicine, ethics, and governance. Power faded, structure endured. Greece did not rule Rome's future, but it shaped how that future was understood. When later empires encountered Greece, they found something unexpectedly intact. Not politically powerful, not militarily relevant, but intellectually dense. A place layered with thought, habit, and memory. Rome had not erased Greece, it had sealed it inside continuity. This is why the conquest resists a clean ending. There is no final victory to celebrate, no collapse to mourn. Rome achieved control, but not replacement. Greece lost sovereignty, but not identity. Each side compromised without admitting it. History often prefers sharper conclusions. This one refuses them. Rome conquered Greece very slowly, by staying longer than resistance could justify. Greece survived Rome even more slowly, by refusing to disappear. Nothing was resolved. Nothing needed to be. The story ends not with triumph or defeat, but with persistence. Greece remained. Rome passed through. And the quiet continued, steady and unremarkable, exactly the way it always had. And with that, the story drifts into its final, almost unnecessary moments. There is very little left to explain, because by now, everything that mattered had already settled into place. Rome was no longer actively conquering. Greece was no longer actively adapting. Both were simply continuing out of habit. What historians later called Roman Greece was not experienced that way by the people living in it. There was no banner overhead announcing the era. Life felt ordinary, predictable, slightly worn at the edges. The kind of existence that does not inspire epics but fills centuries. Power changed hands again, slowly and unevenly. Administrations restructured. Titles evolved. Borders shifted in ways that mattered more on maps than in markets. Greece responded the same way it always had, by adjusting quietly and keeping everything essential intact. Yet the past became something people lived among rather than lived by. Monuments stood without explanation. Old victories lost their urgency. Names survived. Meanings softened. Greece did not insist on being remembered correctly. It settled for being remembered at all. Rome, for all its ambition, never quite solved that problem. Its laws spread widely. Its roads endured. But its voice faded faster than it expected. Greek language, Greek categories of thought, Greek habits of explanation remained stubbornly present long after Roman authority fractured elsewhere. In the end, Rome gained territory, order, and time. Greece lost sovereignty, ambition, and urgency. What both gained was continuity, a shared system that moved forward without needing constant justification. This is why the conquest feels strangely unfinished. How there was no collapse dramatic enough to signal an ending, and no rebirth bold enough to mark a beginning. Everything important simply continued under a different name. Rome conquered Greece very slowly, almost reluctantly. Greece accepted Rome even more slowly, almost indifferently. Neither side got exactly what it wanted. Both got something that lasted. And so the story closes not with conquest, resistance, or triumph, but with routine. Cities opening their gates, teachers repeating lessons, stones remaining where they had always been. History does not always end with noise. Sometimes it just keeps going quietly, until no one feels the need to call it an ending anymore. At this stage, even calling it an ending feels unnecessary. Greece had been living inside long endings for centuries. One power replaced another, each promising permanence, each eventually becoming background. Rome was simply the most organized version of that pattern. What endured was not authority, but familiarity. The way people spoke, the way they learned, the way cities arranged themselves around old centers rather than new ambitions. Greece did not chase the future. It allowed the future to arrive and then calmly adjusted the furniture. Roman influence, once overwhelming, faded into infrastructure. Roads remained useful long after emperors were forgotten. Laws were quoted even when their authors were unclear. Institutions survived because they worked, not because anyone defended them. Greece had always understood that usefulness was safer than glory. By now, the idea of resistance had become impractical rather than dangerous. There was nothing specific left to resist. Power was diffuse, control was administrative. Authority arrived through documents, not soldiers. Greece had learned how to live comfortably inside that system, correcting it gently when necessary and ignoring it when possible. Memory itself slowed down. People remembered customs more clearly than events. Dates mattered less than routines. History became something scholars handled, not something daily life required. This suited Greece well. It had accumulated more history than it needed to actively remember. When new political realities eventually emerged, they felt less like invasions and more like reinterpretations. Old cities adapted again, old structures were renamed, old habits continued. Greece treated each transition the same way, cautiously, patiently, without urgency. So this is why Rome's conquest of Greece does not resolve cleanly. There is no moment when one story ends and another begins. The shift is so gradual that it resists narration. It feels more like a long afternoon than a decisive act. Rome believed it had conquered Greece by taking control of its territory. Greece believed it had survived Rome by maintaining its way of life. Both assessments were accurate. Neither required celebration. And so, quietly, Greece moved forward, carrying layers of rule the way it carried layers of stone, stacked, reused, occasionally repaired, rarely questioned. Rome became one of those layers, important once, foundational for a time, eventually just part of the structure. Nothing dramatic remained to say. The conquest had succeeded by becoming invisible, and Greece, as it always had, it remained very good at living inside invisibility. By now, the story has stretched so thin that even history seems reluctant to add more. That reluctance is appropriate. Nothing new happened, and that was the point. Greece had become a place where novelty rarely arrived uninvited. Generations grew up without ever knowing a time before Roman administration. For them, Rome was not an occupying force or a foreign power. It was paperwork. It was tax schedules. It was the distant name attached to authority, rarely seen and almost never felt directly. Greece had not been subdued so much as filed. Local identity adjusted accordingly. Pride shifted away from political independence and toward continuity. Cities competed over antiquity rather than influence. Which temple was older? Which school traced its origins further back? Which tradition had survived the most interruptions? Greece measured itself by endurance, not dominance. Education continued to reward repetition. Students learned to argue positions that no longer carried political consequences. Rhetoric became exercise rather than weapon. Philosophy became discipline rather than disruption. Rome did not suppress thought. It dulled its urgency. Greece accepted the trade. Even ambition softened. Wealth was accumulated carefully, not aggressively. Public generosity mattered more than expansion. The goal was stability, not ascent. Families planned for survival, not transformation. Greece had learned what transformation usually cost. Roman officials rarely interfered unless necessary. A stable Greece benefited everyone. There were no frontiers to defend here, no rebellions to anticipate, and no resources worth exhausting effort over. Greece was valuable precisely because it did not require attention. That made it invisible, and invisibility proved protective. Over time, the physical presence of Rome diminished further. Fewer officials passed through. Fewer decrees arrived. Governance became increasingly local in practice, even if imperial in theory. Greece had learned to govern itself quietly inside someone else's framework. The landscape reflected this maturity. No grand new cities emerged. No dramatic reconstructions followed disasters. Repairs were incremental. Stones were reused. Buildings were adapted. Greece aged without panic. It had done so before. When historians later searched for turning points, they struggled. Dates existed, but significance did not. The conquest had no climax, yet the occupation had no resistance phase. The end had no clear beginning. Everything important happened between sentences, not within them. Rome had arrived with armies and left behind habits. Greece received those habits and integrated them into its own long rhythm. Neither side fully controlled the outcome. The process exceeded intention. This is what makes the conquest difficult to dramatize. Drama requires rupture. Greece specialized in continuity. Rome specialized in structure. Together they produce something stable, quiet, and resistant to narrative. Eventually, historians stopped trying to force a conclusion and settled for explanation. Rome conquered Greece, they wrote, and then Greece continued. Both statements were true. Neither was complete. And so, at last, the story rests, not because it has reached a satisfying end, but because it has nothing urgent left to add. Greece remained. Rome passed through. The world moved on. Nothing exploded. Nothing redeemed itself. Nothing collapsed. The conquest succeeded by becoming ordinary. And Greece, having outlived far louder moments, accepted that ordinariness as a kind of victory. And so the quiet continuation carries on, almost stubbornly refusing to conclude. Greece by now had perfected the art of existing under layers. Each new layer of authority arrived with claims of permanence, and each was absorbed with the same calm indifference. Rome had promised order. Greece accepted it, filed it away, and went back to doing what it had always done. Time flattened distinctions. What had once been Roman policy became local custom. What had once been Greek tradition became background expectation. Our people no longer separated the two. They lived inside a blended routine where origins mattered less than functionality. If something worked, it stayed. If it did not, it faded without argument. The economy reflected this long calm. Trade continued at a steady, unremarkable pace. Ports opened each morning. Goods moved inland. Taxes were assessed, negotiated, and paid. Wealth accumulated quietly in families that understood patience. No one chased sudden fortune. Greece had learned that sudden change attracted attention, and attention rarely improved outcomes. Social life narrowed inward. Public ambition softened into private stability. Status came from education, ancestry, and reliability rather than conquest or innovation. Greece valued those who could maintain rather than transform. Survival had become a craft. And even memory itself adapted. Stories of resistance and defeat lost their sharpness. They were retold without urgency, as lessons rather than warnings. Children learned about Rome the way they learned about older empires, as something that happened and then settled into the background. The emotional weight disappeared. History became informational. Rome, meanwhile, continued doing what it did everywhere else, gradually wearing itself down through scale. Its systems stretched thin. Its attention shifted. Its priorities moved on. Greece noticed none of this directly. Decline happened far away, filtered through distance and delay. Local life remained stable long after imperial confidence faded. When authority eventually changed shape again, Greece treated it as another adjustment. Documents were rewritten, titles updated, administrations renamed. The process felt familiar. Greece had been trained by Rome to expect continuity disguised as change. What Rome never quite understood was that conquest required maintenance, not arrival. Greece understood this instinctively. That is why it survived. It did not demand resolution. It accepted extension. Looking back, it becomes difficult to say where Rome's control truly ended. There is no clear line where influence stops and inheritance begins. Greece had absorbed too much, too gradually, for separation to remain meaningful. Rome became one of many contributors to a long, accumulated present. This makes the conquest unsatisfying to summarize. There is no dramatic lesson, no clean moral. Rome did not destroy Greece. Greece did not defeat Rome. Both participated in something slower, quieter, and more enduring than victory. Greece learned how to exist without urgency. Rome learned how to rely on something it could not replace. The result was stability, not excitement. Longevity, not glory. And that is why this story refuses to end properly. Endings imply closure. Greece preferred continuation. Rome provided structure. Together, they produced centuries of quiet normalcy. By the time anyone thought to ask who had won, the question itself had lost relevance. Greece was still there. Rome, in its original form, was not. That answer arrived slowly, without announcement. Nothing dramatic marked the transition. No ceremony closed the chapter. The world simply kept going, as it always does, indifferent to labels. Rome conquered Greece very slowly. Greece survived Rome by not insisting on being finished. The conquest did not echo. It settled. And in that settling, Greece found exactly what it needed: enough stability to remain and enough obscurity to be left alone. By this point, even the idea of continuing feels slightly redundant. Greece had been continuing for so long that it no longer experienced time as a series of chapters. It experienced it as accumulation. One practice added to another, one authority layered over the last. Nothing needed to be resolved in order to move forward. Roman systems lingered mostly because removing them would have required effort. Courts still followed established procedures. Taxes were still calculated in familiar ways. Titles still carried weight, even if no one remembered who had invented them. Greece kept what functioned and quietly ignored what did not. This selective memory became a survival skill. Daily life remained modest. Ambition existed, but it aimed downward rather than outward. Families wanted stability, not expansion. Cities wanted repairs, not transformation. The future was imagined as a continuation of the present, slightly improved if possible, unchanged if improvement proved inconvenient. Greece had learned to negotiate with reality rather than challenge it. The physical environment mirrored this attitude. Ancient roads were patched instead of replaced. Public buildings were subdivided, repurposed, or partially abandoned. Space was reused intelligently, not reverently. Greece did not worship its ruins. It lived inside them. Language continued to bind everything together. Greek remained the medium of thought, instruction, and administration. Yet even when authority came from elsewhere, it arrived translated. This mattered more than armies ever had. Power could rule without understanding. Life could not. Greece kept control of meaning by keeping control of language. Rome's presence, once decisive, now felt theoretical. Its influence persisted through habit rather than enforcement. Officials came and went without ceremony. Decrees were issued, acknowledged, and filed. No one expected intervention unless something went wrong. Most things did not. When change finally did arrive, it came disguised as routine. A new ruler, a revised tax structure, a renamed office. Greece treated these developments as adjustments, not disruptions. The skill lay in absorbing change without allowing it to feel significant. Rome had taught this lesson unintentionally, and Greece had mastered it. This mastery explains why the conquest never produced a clean aftermath. There was no cultural vacuum to fill, no identity crisis to resolve. Greece already knew who it was, even if that identity had become quieter, less demanding, and far more patient. Looking back, it becomes clear that Rome succeeded not by overpowering Greece, but by fitting into it. And Greece survived not by resisting Rome, but by allowing Rome to become just another layer. Neither strategy required speed. Both required time. Time, in the end, favored the quieter approach. And so the narrative slows even further, settling into something that barely qualifies as a story. No climaxes remain, no reversals are coming. Only continuation, steady and unremarkable, stretching forward. Greece remains where it has always been, adapting, enduring, sun and waiting without impatience. Rome, having done its part, fades into structure, memory, and footnotes. The conquest does not end. It simply becomes part of the background. And the background, as Greece had learned long ago, is where survival happens most reliably. Eventually, even the background itself grows quiet, not because anything has stopped, but because nothing demands attention anymore. Greece has settled into a long, low hum of existence, the kind that rarely appears in textbooks and never in speeches. It is there, doing its work, sustaining itself without asking to be noticed. By now, Rome exists in Greece mostly as inherited structure, not as legions, not as emperors, but as habits of organization that no longer feel foreign. Administrative boundaries linger, legal phrases survive, and architectural layouts repeat themselves. Rome has become less a ruler and more a framework that Greece learned to operate comfortably. People stop telling stories about conquest altogether. The word feels excessive. What happened was too slow, too administrative, too polite to deserve it. No one feels conquered in their daily life. They feel managed, perhaps. But management has become routine. Routine has become comfort. Greece, once restless and argumentative, has grown patient. Not resigned exactly, more selective. It chooses which changes to absorb and which to let pass by. It has learned that most power burns itself out if ignored long enough. Endurance, not resistance, turns out to be the more reliable strategy. The past remains everywhere, but without urgency. Old names survive without context. Its buildings stand without explanation. Traditions continue without anyone quite remembering why. Greece does not correct these gaps. It allows them. Memory, like architecture, does not need to be complete to be functional. Rome never planned for this outcome. Conquest was supposed to simplify. Control was supposed to clarify. Instead, Greece blurred everything gently until authority softened into familiarity. Rome ruled, but it did not redefine. Greece adjusted, but it did not disappear. The balance held because neither side pushed too hard. As time stretches on, even historians grow quiet. There are fewer documents, fewer proclamations, more assumptions. The story does not end because nothing breaks. It simply thins, dispersing into ordinary life. And that is where it remains. Rome conquered Greece very slowly, yet mostly by staying longer than conflict could justify. Greece survived Rome by becoming something that did not need to be defeated. No final act arrives, no resolution is announced. The world continues, layered, reused, and mostly unbothered. History, having done all it needed to do, steps aside. And Greece, as it has so many times before, keeps going. And finally, the quiet becomes complete. Not silence exactly, but the absence of anything that insists on being remembered. Greece remains, functioning at a level so ordinary that it escapes attention entirely. This is not decline. It is something closer to equilibrium. What once required armies now requires clerks. What once inspired speeches now requires maintenance. The grand questions that once defined Greek history, freedom, power, dominance, no longer appear in daily life. They have been replaced by smaller concerns, which turn out to be far more durable. Rome, by this point, has fulfilled its role without realizing it. It provided enough structure for Greece to stabilize, and enough distance for Greece to remain itself. The empire did not freeze Greece in time, nor did it erase it. It simply slowed everything down. Slowness, it turns out, was exactly what Greece needed. In that slowed world, ideas lasted longer than rulers, language lasted longer than borders, habits lasted longer than laws. Greece stopped needing to define itself against anyone. It became self-contained again, not through isolation, but through familiarity. When later generations look back, they struggle to find the moment where Rome truly won. The battles are easy to list, the treaties are easy to cite. Yet the outcome is harder to describe. Control happened. Independence ended. But something essential remained untouched, simply because it was never directly challenged. Rome conquered territory. Greece kept continuity. That is why this story never really lands. It drifts. It settles. It fades into routine. The conquest succeeds by losing its sharp edges, and the conquered survive by refusing to sharpen theirs. If there is a lesson here, it is not about power or resistance. It is about time. Time rewards what adapts quietly and punishes what demands resolution. Greece understood this long before Rome arrived. Rome learned it without meaning to, and so the narrative does not close with a conclusion, but with acceptance. Greece does not reclaim its past, it carries it. Rome does not disappear, it becomes a layer. History does not announce an ending, it simply grows less interested. The conquest of Greece ends not with victory or defeat, but with persistence, steady, patient, and almost invisible. Which, after everything, feels like the only ending Greece would ever allow. And with that, there is almost nothing left to add. The quiet has done its work. Greece has settled so thoroughly into continuity that even change arrives gently, like something expected rather than announced. What once felt like Roman rule has thinned into custom. People no longer attribute stability to an empire. They attribute it to familiarity. Roads are used because they exist. Laws are followed because they are known. Language continues because it is spoken. No one feels the need to justify any of it. This is what Rome never quite anticipated. Conquest did not produce dependence. It produced routine. And routine, once established, no longer requires the conqueror to remain strong. Greece learned how to function without watching the center too closely. Authority became something distant, procedural, and mostly ignorable. The landscape confirms this indifference. Nothing new insists on dominating the old. Additions blend in quietly or fail without comment. Greece does not chase renewal. It allows replacement only when necessary. Survival has taught it that permanence is not achieved by force, but by patience. Even decline, when it comes, feels muted. It is gradual, uneven, and rarely alarming. Greece has lived through sharper collapses than this. Compared to them, Roman decline feels administrative rather than catastrophic. Another adjustment. Another layer loosening. By now, and no one speaks of Rome conquering Greece in lived experience. That language belongs entirely to historians. For those within the story, Rome is something inherited, not imposed, a condition, not an event. This is the final irony of the conquest. Rome achieved control so thoroughly that it stopped being visible. Greece adapted so completely that it stopped feeling conquered. Both sides succeeded in ways neither had planned. And so the story does not end with a final image or a decisive sentence. It simply slows until it becomes indistinguishable from background time. The kind of time people live inside without noticing. Greece remains. Not triumphant, not restored, just present. Rome remains too, but only as structure, habit, and faint memory. Nothing dramatic concludes the relationship. No chapter closes cleanly. History, and having nothing urgent left to say, moves on to louder stories elsewhere. Here, everything stays quiet. Rome conquered Greece very slowly. Greece survived Rome by becoming slower still, and the quiet, having won without effort, continues. By now, the story exists mostly as inertia. Not movement, not change, just the steady refusal to collapse. Greece has reached a point where even survival no longer feels like an effort. It is simply what happens when nothing pushes hard enough to stop it. The Roman world around Greece continues to rearrange itself. Emperors rise and fall with increasing speed. Reforms are announced, revised, and quietly abandoned. Authority grows more ceremonial as distance increases. Greece receives these shifts the way it receives weather, with mild adjustment and no commentary. Local life remains stubbornly small in scale. Neighborhoods matter more than capitals. Reputation matters more than policy. People know which families can be trusted, which officials can be avoided, which traditions are flexible and which are not. These details never appear in imperial records, but they determine everything. Education continues in reduced form, quieter but persistent. Teachers instruct fewer students. Texts are copied more slowly. Errors appear, then survive. Greece no longer aims for intellectual dominance. It aims for preservation. The goal is not to perfect knowledge, but to keep it from disappearing entirely. Religion, too, continues its long adjustment. Old beliefs fade without violence. New beliefs settle without urgency. Sacred spaces are reused. Language shifts meaning rather than vocabulary. Greece treats belief the way it treats architecture. Adapt what exists, avoid rebuilding from nothing. Rome's authority becomes increasingly symbolic. Its presence is felt most strongly in absence. When something goes wrong, Rome is far away. When something works, Rome takes quiet credit. Greece learns to rely on itself again, not through rebellion, but through necessity. This self-reliance does not resemble independence. There are no declarations, no restored sovereignty. It is practical autonomy, exercised without announcement. Greece manages its own continuity inside a framework that no longer actively interferes. The past continues to surround everything, but without pressure. Ancient names remain on streets. Old victories remain carved into stone. No one feels obligated to live up to them. Yes, Greece has learned that expectation is heavier than memory. Letting the past exist without obligation makes it lighter. From the outside, this period looks uneventful. From the inside, it feels stable. And stability, after centuries of upheaval, is a form of success rarely acknowledged. Rome, once restless and expansive, slows in parallel. Its energy diffuses. Its structures harden. What remains is not conquest, but residue. Roads, laws, administrative habits. Greece absorbs these fully now, because they no longer compete with anything. This is where the conquest finally becomes irrelevant. Not because it failed, but because it finished dissolving. It no longer shapes choices or defines identity. It sits behind everything, invisible and unquestioned. Historians may insist on marking an end somewhere here, if only for convenience. A date, a reform, a transition of power. But none of these feel decisive enough to close the story. Greece has learned that endings are optional. What persists instead is continuity without urgency. A society content to exist without explaining itself. A culture that has learned how to be quiet without vanishing. Rome conquered Greece very slowly. Greece absorbed Rome even more slowly. Neither noticed exactly when the process stopped mattering. And that is where the story finally rests. Not because it has concluded, but because it no longer requires narration. The quiet holds. Nothing demands the next sentence. And Greece, patient as ever, continues without asking whether anyone is still watching. And at last, the quiet settles into something like permanence. Not an ending, yet not a conclusion, just a point where the story no longer needs to move forward to make sense. Greece has reached a state where history stops pressing questions and starts offering background. Nothing dramatic interrupts daily life. Markets open. Paths are walked smooth. Old stones remain where they are because moving them would require effort, and effort is reserved for necessity. Greece has learned how to conserve energy across centuries. Rome, now distant in every practical way, survives only through systems that continue to function. No one feels loyalty to emperors they will never see. Loyalty belongs to routines, neighborhoods, and the slow predictability of local life. Authority has become impersonal, and impersonal authority is easier to live with. Memory thins further. Fewer people can explain why certain customs exist, and they simply know that they do. Greece no longer needs justification for its habits. Explanation belongs to scholars. Living belongs to everyone else. Education becomes quieter still. Teaching happens in smaller rooms, sometimes privately, sometimes informally. Knowledge is passed on because someone remembers how, not because the state demands it. Greece carries learning the way it carries language, by use, not by decree. The landscape remains layered but calm. No new monuments demand attention. Old ones continue fading without complaint. Greece does not mourn the loss of clarity. Ambiguity has proven safer than pride. If Rome once imagined its conquest as a decisive act, it would be disappointed by this outcome. Control did not lead to transformation. It led to normalization. Greece normalized Roman rule until it ceased to feel Roman at all. That normalization is the true conclusion, not victory, not defeat, just absorption so complete that it no longer registers. This is where historians quietly stop writing, because nothing changes fast enough to justify another paragraph. The centuries continue, but they repeat rather than progress. Greece does not mind. Repetition has kept it alive. Rome conquered Greece very slowly. Greece survived Rome by making that conquest boring. No legends remain. No warnings linger. Just continuity, steady and unremarkable. And in the end, that steadiness outlasts everything else. The story does not close. It simply goes quiet. By now, the quiet has stretched so far that it almost feels intentional. Greece is no longer reacting to history at all, and it is simply inhabiting it, the way one inhabits a landscape that has been familiar for generations. Nothing demands interpretation. Nothing insists on urgency. The systems left behind by Rome continue to function mostly because no one bothers to dismantle them. Courts operate. Taxes are assessed. Records are kept, sometimes carefully, sometimes poorly. Greece does not resist these processes, but it does not celebrate them either. They exist. That is enough. People measure time differently now, not by reigns or reforms, but by seasons and local events. A good harvest, a repaired road, a festival that still happens on roughly the same day every year. These markers matter more than imperial developments unfolding far away. Even conflict, when it appears, is small and contained. Disputes remain local. Violence is limited. Problems are solved through negotiation, familiarity, and fatigue rather than force. Greece has learned that escalation is expensive and rarely productive. The past, once a source of identity, has become furniture. It is everywhere, useful, sometimes inconvenient, but never questioned. Greece no longer compares itself to what it was. Comparison implies dissatisfaction. It has learned to avoid that. Rome, long gone as an active presence, survives only in outline, in words, in habits, in stone. Greece does not feel abandoned by its absence. If anything, absence makes life simpler. Authority that does not intervene allows routine to deepen. At some point, even historians lose interest in assigning significance. There are no clear transitions left to mark. The story does not rise or fall. It levels out. And leveling out, yes, after centuries of upheaval, feels like success. This is the final state of the conquest. Not domination, not liberation, but normalization so complete that the concept of conquest becomes academic rather than experiential. Rome conquered Greece very slowly. Greece rendered that conquest unremarkable. And unremarkable things in history tend to last the longest. Nothing announces the end. Nothing needs to. The quiet holds, steady and sufficient. And Greece, having mastered the art of continuity, remains exactly where it has always been. Still there, still functioning, still refusing to provide a dramatic conclusion.